today we're going to talk about the physical internet. It's a little bit of an interesting sort of topic, and it's not sort of your typical sort of .NET, user group sort of presentation, but I think, a lot of us kind of use the internet every day, and it's kind of interesting to know sort of what happens behind the scenes of when you, plug in or connect to the Wi-Fi and things like that. So a little bit about me, grantH@microsoft.com. You can get to my blog via that link. You might have noticed from the title there, I'm a senior service engineer. Now, I'm the only senior service engineer in Australia, and that's because it's really it's an engineering title, and not a lot of engineering happens in Microsoft Australia. And the reason that is because the majority of it happens, over here in North America. And these little black markers are the team that I work on. So I'm down here in Australia. I've got colleagues in India, colleagues in Europe, colleagues in east coast of the US, and then the rest of the team is kind of the west coast of the US. And the service that I work on is Visual Studio Online. And so, I'm working on this online service that's used by people all around the world, and I kind of have this sort of pet interest in connectivity. Being in Australia, we're a long way from anybody, besides ourselves. And so, when you're working on the internet, it's kind of I find it really cool to understand kind of what's happening between me and the servers and me and my colleagues and things like that. So we're going to just go through a very sort of short history. I apologise, it's a little bit sort of disjoint, but I'm like, okay, where do you start? Do you start at your computer, or do you start at the other end, or do you start halfway? I decided to start with submarine cables, because that's probably I think the sort of coolest bit of the internet. Then we're going to talk about where do those cables kind of plug into, and where do those things kind of plug into again. Then I'm going to talk about some other stuff which is kind of related but kind of not. The way that I kind of got really interested in this is this photo. I saw this on the Wired magazine. They had an article, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago by this guy called Andrew Blum. Does anybody take a guess of what this is or where this is? Yep, submarine cable coming ashore somewhere. And so you can see just on the left-hand side of the photo there's a little, little manhole cover. If you look at the trees and things, you'd probably guess, maybe, Halifax, Canada. And that's right, it's Halifax, Canada, which is where one of the transatlantic cables is actually coming ashore, lands in the, the little manhole, and then, where does it go from there? But the thing that sort of piqued my interest there is like, wow, how many of these are there around the world, and kind of, what's under that manhole cover? So fortunately, the guy who posted that article, was writing a book at the time, and it was a bit of a sort of self-promotion for his book. And so if you want to learn, sort of all about this, go and grab this off Amazon. It's called Tubes, which I thought's a pretty, unique sort of name. But then the other bit that kind of piqued my interest is, does anybody remember these signs? Yep, so this is a photo of a sign that you'll see down the south coast, or pretty much anywhere from Canberra to Sydney. I think there's one over in Balmain as well, going under the harbour. And when I first sort of saw this, I was a young kid at the time, and I was probably travelling with my grandparents. And I said, what does this sign mean? Because it's kind of, it's a little bit sort of fuzzy. It kind of looks like a boat, and it kind of looks like, the seabed or something, and there's like a line going down. And it says submarine cable. I said, what's that? And they said, it's to stop the Japanese submarines, coming up the river, and so that they can't attack us during the war. It's like, okay, because I didn't know any better at that time. This is, a while ago. And then as I got a bit older, I kind of, kept going down the coast for holidays, and I'd sort of look at it and I go, hang on a minute. If it's there to, protect, the rivers against submarines, why don't they have a big sign saying, hang on, there's protection here? And I'm like, nah, something just doesn't add up. And then I realised, there's a cable underneath, and it's saying, hey, watch out boats, don't drop your anchors, because there's a cable down there. So, there's plenty of these around. Some of them have got the really old telecom logo on them, and that kind of shows you how old these sort of signs are. But if you go down to Bateman's Bay down the south coast, there's always one next to the either side of the river on the bridge. Does anybody know who this guy is, or wants to take a guess? He looks pretty important because he's got lots of numbers and formulas and sort of stuff behind him. He's got a big kind of white beard, and he looks kind of pretty old. His name's Lord Kelvin. Does anybody know what Lord Kelvin's famous for? Sorry? Fahrenheit, yep, Fahrenheit was one. And anything else? No? Yep. Kelvin is a unit of measurement of temperature. So, Lord Kelvin was a physicist and, scientist and just general sort of inquisitive mind. And he actually, the thing that he's kind of most famous for is the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And then that's where the unit of measurement of, the Kelvin comes from, which is like Celsius and Fahrenheit. Anyway, it turns out that he also was one of the pioneers of telegraphic cables. And when they were laying the transatlantic telegraph cable from the UK to New York, or the US, he kind of got along onto the ship, and he sort of helped out with taking observations and measurements, and he came up with a whole bunch of theories. One of the things in particular that he came up with is the measurement of bandwidth. And so he calculated the bandwidth of the telegraphic cable to be, at that point in time, it was capable of sending a character every 3.5 seconds. So, think about that's not a byte, that's a character. So think about how fast or slow that cable was at the time. But the other thing that he was, sort of responsible for was something that he called the mirror galvanometer. And what kind of happened was, they've got this big cable strung across the ocean, and because of the currents and the ocean currents, and they've got this big chunk of copper, they had to kind of measure, or down one end of the cable they'd kind of send a signal, and they had to be able to measure that signal down the other end of the cable. And it turns out the device they had previous to this was just so inaccurate that all they were recording was just noise. Anyway, he came up with a better way to do it, and he invented this tool called the mirror galvanometer. Anyway, once he's got this mirror galvanometer, this mirror thing, he's like, okay, we can basically it kind of deflects light, and because it's deflecting light, it's not deflecting any sort of physical matter, which means that it's very sensitive to any sort of changes in the current of the cable. And so once you've got this kind of deflection of light, you need to be able to record it somehow. And so then he invented this thing called a siphon receiver, which basically takes those deflections and plots them on a bit of paper. And using that bit of paper, they can then determine, the kind of variations in current, and that's the signal or the message that was transmitted over the cable. And so, because he got involved in all this, he created patents on these two devices, and that formed, the basis of telegraphic sort of communication. So, very smart guy. This is a map of from 1865, and it shows you've got UK over here, you've got the undersea telegraphic cable here, you've got the Trans-America telegraphic cable, and then it goes all up through Russia, and kind of basically it sort of circles the world. And this is really early days, and this is kind of where it all started. So now we're going to sort of jump into what are the parts of a sort of submarine cable. Probably can't see that too well, but I'm going to go into each of these kind of things, in a bit more detail. But essentially, in the early days, the cable just kind of sat on the seabed. These days, they actually bury it in the seabed to give it a little bit more protection. Every about 100 kilometres, there's this thing called a repeater, and the repeater basically takes the signal that's coming through the optical fibres, and it's powered, so it's able to take that signal in and kind of retransmit it so that the next repeater can pick it up and sort of push that signal along. Then it sort of comes along, and it depends where in the world and kind of the local sort of conditions, they'll actually they'll bury it into the beach essentially, but underwater, and then it goes through basically a conduit to a landing station. Whoops. I'll talk about that a bit more later. So this is a graph from a company called Telegeography, and what it shows is the capacity of submarine cables coming into Australia from the year 2007 until the year 2011. And so the white bit up the top of the graph here is kind of total capacity, and this is 2 terabits per second basically. And then the white bit indicates repurposed existing cables, and the red bit indicates new cables. And so what you can see here is that in the last, however many years that is, the bulk of our capacity has actually come from upgrading existing cables rather than laying new cables. And the way that they're able to do that is the technology on basically this submarine cable is just a piece of optical fibre, it's just a piece of glass. And the way they're able to kind of upgrade the capacity is they can change the equipment on either end, and then that way they can actually shove more data through the same cable. And that's actually really interesting when we get into the business of why people lay these cables and all that sort of stuff. What you can kind of see down the bottom here is 2008 is Telstra Endeavour. That's a big cable that Telstra commissioned from Australia to Hawaii. And then this is a really significant one, the Pipe Pacific cable, 2009, it got lit up. Now, does anybody remember sort of the year 2000 or pre-2000? Well, first of all, who was using the internet in 2000, 2001? I certainly was. Pretty much everybody. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people. Anybody in this kind of community would be. I remember those days where you'd pay for a DSL was sort of starting to come along. Telstra had their plans, but they cost a fortune, and the amount that you got to download was quite small. And before they added the metering and all that sort of stuff. But then, sort of 2001, the prices started to change. You started being able to go to different providers, and you could get bigger caps, and you could get cheaper, bandwidth, and all that sort of stuff. The other thing that happened is 2009, there was a significant reduction, or in cost, or increase in caps and things like that. And that was mainly because of this Pipe Pacific cable being kind of lit up. But let's look at these guys. So these are the original sort of telegraphic cables. They kind of look homemade. You can see here that there's stranded copper conductor with some brass tape around it, tar-soaked jute. Don't know what the jute is, and then some outer armour, which is kind of like steel sort of cables. And then we jump into mid 1950s, 1970s. They're still doing telephone cables at that point in time, and so you've still got copper running through the cables with some armour and some polyethylene and all that sort of stuff. But these days, this is kind of what we're working with. You'll see right in the middle here is these are very fine strands, and I think there's probably like 4 strands in there, or 2 pairs they call it. And then what you'll see is that there's some armor. There's still a copper conductor around it. Can anybody think of why there'd be a copper conductor around this this glass, kind of fiber optic? Why do you need? Sorry. Yep, great answer. But to power something, don't you need a ground and a power source? You need like a positive and a negative. Yep, that's right. So what they actually do to power their repeaters, which are spread 8,000 kilometres across the ocean and 100 kilometres apart, is they actually put like 10,000 volts of electricity through the copper sheathing. And that's kind of the that's the positive, if you like, and then the ground is just the ocean. And so and then the repeaters are able to draw across, draw out of the water the ground, and draw the positive energy out of the copper sheathing, and that's how they actually power the repeaters, all the way across the ocean. Instead of imagine having solar panels hanging up from the ocean or something like that. That just kind of wouldn't work. The other thing that you notice is they sort of come in different sizes depending upon how many strands they have to hold. There's also depending on sort of what sort of terrain they have to cover. And the other thing, they say that 80% of cable sort of, they call it cable, they don't call it cuts, they call it cable aggression or external aggression events is actually from fishermen. And because what happens is the fishermen will put their nets or they'll put their anchors down and they'll just drag them along the ocean, they'll pick up a cable, or they'll attach it straight into the cable, and then that's how you end up with a sort of a cable cut. So as these cables kind of travel through heavy fishermen areas or closer to shore, they actually add extra layers of armour, and so that's why this one you can see it's got an inner armour and an outer armour, and then it's got sort of extra kind of sheathing on the outside. But the actual glass fibres themselves, they're absolutely tiny.
So where you've got a repeater, if we're going to change the signal that travels through the glass fibre, Is there not some sort of technology associated with the repeater that you'd have to also replace?
Yep. It's a good question. The question was, with the repeater, is there some sort of technology that you have to replace in the repeater to kind of upgrade, the link or so? And the answer is no, because the repeater is just, it's just amplifying the light. And so what they actually do to increase the capacity is, instead of just sending a single kind of a single strand of kind of white light through this cable, they do this thing called multiplexing, and multiplexing allows them to send 100 different colors of light down the same cable, and because they're different colors, they're not going to kind of interact with each other. So as long as the repeater and the amplifier can take that same light in and amplify that same light, the repeaters themselves don't have to change. But what does have to change is the senders and the receivers on either end of the cable. Here's kind of 3 different examples of different companies that make the repeaters, but what you can see is approximate 1.8, 3 meters or 4.4 meters. The actual repeater themselves isn't very big. This one here, they say it's, what's that, 300 mil. So not very big at all. But the thing that makes them quite large is these bend limiters on the end, because what you don't want to have happening is this cable coming in, accidentally gets bent at a right angle before it goes into the repeater, because once you bend a piece of fibre optic beyond a certain limit, you break the fibre and then it's no good at sort of transmitting the light. Yeah, exactly, and you get signal loss and all that sort of stuff. So that's why if you ever get fibre installed in your home, make sure that they're not kind of putting it around 90-degree corners and things like that.
Did you say that they've only got 4 cables in each one of these? That seems incredibly small. If you're going to run such an expensive thing, I would have thought you'd put 400 in, because that would only be a small amount more expensive than 4.
When you're talking about 8,000 kilometres of cable, so I'll try and bring up a photo later on of one of the ships that they use to kind of lay these cables, and just the amount of cable, like 8,000 kilometres of cable in a ship takes up like the entire kind of hull.
But the cable is sort of that wide,
yep.
That much, thinner than that,
yep.
That wide,
yep.
Width of fibre optic in the middle of it, and I would have thought that you would be able to put a dozen in there without any more cost, really.
Yeah, I know that's true when you're doing it sort of on land, domestically. I'm guessing that the economics don't kind of work out when you're doing it over like really long distances. Like for example, the Pacific Pipe cable, when it landed in Sydney, instead of just putting in enough, because you've got this submarine cable coming in and then they've got to connect it up to their own buildings and things like that. Instead of just putting the same amount, they actually put in they've got these big conduits and they just shoved it full of as much cable as they could, because the incremental cost of doing that was not very much. But across the ocean, it's probably a different story. What's interesting about laying these cables is that there's kind of 2 different, well, there used to be 2 different ways to do it, and there kind of still is 2 different ways, but the majority of it is this privately financed stuff. But what used to happen is you'd have this consortium that would get together. So think of the Telstras or the telecoms, of every country, that needs to be connected, kind of getting together and sort of splitting the cost. And then they'd form this kind of joint entity who'd lay the cable and they'd operate the cable. And then what they do is they sell these things called virtual circuits. And a virtual circuit comes from the telephone days, where when you kind of set up a phone call to somebody, they were connecting up that circuit, and that circuit was wholly yours, for the duration of that call. Whereas in the internet world, you don't have dedicated bandwidth between you and your servers. You're just kind of sending some traffic out, and it gets routed however it can get routed, and by whatever network is kind of along the way, and you don't have this dedicated kind of circuit for you. But what kind of happened was these consortiums were selling these kind of dedicated circuits. But at the same time, as the technology improved, they were able to upgrade the capacity of the cable. They could put more circuits on it. They could sell more circuits, and they're making huge profits by, because they're able to increase the capacity of the thing. But they're still selling, these kind of dedicated, parts of the cable. But they made the cable bigger. Anyway, some investors got together, and they mainly came from this company, which I'll show you in a minute, Telegeography. They worked out that, hang on, we could probably, find investors to, put up the capital cost of laying down a big cable, and then instead of, operating the cable, we'll sell the rights to the actual fibre pairs within the cable to other operators, and then they can put their own technology in either end. And this is how, the Telstras, the pipe networks, this is how a lot of people do it these days, because, if they the way they do it is they put the stuff on, and that might get them, 100 megabits, today. But as the optical fibre technology improves, that'll get them 200 megabits or 10 gigabits or whatever, as the sort of technology improves. And so because they're only paying for the fibre, it's up to them how much they're willing to invest in the technology to get the kind of bandwidth. And so this is an extract of one of the maps that you can get, and it kind of shows, Australia's connection to the outside world. Anything anybody wants to observe from that?
It's like expensive to run New Caledonia to Australia.
Yeah, so you can see here, there's actually a link here. I think it's Gondwana 1 or something. So if you've ever been holidaying in New Caledonia, your options for internet are either satellite or come back to Australia. As in, your traffic comes back to Australia and then goes to the US or Europe or whatever. Australia until, sort of 2000, our only sort of connectivity was via New Zealand, and then New Zealand to Hawaii over, I think it was like 500 megabits. And that seems like a lot, but it's not a lot, considering it's a whole country. But what happened was Southern Cross cable got lit up, and it's actually it's like a figure 8 kind of ring that goes from not Canberra, I'm from Canberra, goes Sydney to New Zealand to Hawaii, and because it's like a figure 8, if any one of those kind of sort of segments has a break in it, they're able to route it across the redundant kind of link. The other one that you'll see here is, in fact, it's probably a good time to jump up to the map. So if we go to, you can actually go to Submarine Cable Map 2014.telegeography.com, and they've got an interactive map here, so you can come along. Oh. Thank you for letting me know. So it's Submarine Cable Map 2014.telegeography.com, and if you want to, you can actually buy this as a wall map. And so it's only $250 US. You can get the flat, the World is Flat edition, or you can get the folded edition. And then they actually have every year they kind of produce a new version, and each year they kind of have these different little sort of info sort of segments. And so what you can see here is, here's the kind of the innards of the cable. This one is quite interesting. This is cable maintenance. And so if a cable breaks in, let's say, somewhere near Indonesia or Indonesia's waters, it's going to be like 22 days before it's, notified, and then another, or notified to departure time. Not quite sure what that means, but it also takes them a long time to actually transit to the cable break itself.
Probably how long it takes them to get a ship so that they can head out there.
Yeah, notified departure time. So I guess that's exactly right. The time it takes them to get a ship. However, if you have a cable break in Canada, we're talking less than sort of 5 days to get it fixed and all that sort of stuff. Causes of faults. This is where we were talking about before. Of the I guess that's percentage. 38% fishing, 25% anchorage, 11% other. Component failure, only 6%. So the actual components seem to be fairly reliable or resilient. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting here is they actually divide up the world and into who's responsible for, or which kind of organisations responsible for kind of looking after and fixing cables in certain zones. Now, what's really interesting here is that Australia, all these cables coming out of Australia, they're not part of any zone. Now, I don't know whether that's because they're a special zone or because they're kind of nobody looks after them, but yeah, a little bit worrying. Yeah. The other thing that we can look at is seabed profiles. So this one is actually quite fascinating. If we go to, there we go, Emperor. So one of the things that there's this, one of the major cables. In fact, we'll just scroll out here a bit. The main way, the main way that you get internet out of Australia is via the Southern Cross cable, which is a loop here and a loop up here to the US, or it's via the Australia-Japan cable, which goes basically north-south between Australia and Japan via Guam, or there's that cable I mentioned before, the Pipe Pacific Networks cable, which goes directly from Sydney to Guam. But what's interesting is just outside of Guam, anybody know what lies in the ocean around here? Sorry? Volcanoes, yeah, it's actually the trench, the Mariana Trench. And the Mariana Trench is 8,000, I mean, this is not it, this is a different trench, but the Mariana Trench is 11, yeah, there we go. Deepest part of the planet at over 12,000 metres, and the cable system crosses it to reach Sydney from Guam. So just as a reference point, Mount Everest is 8,800 metres above sea level. And so just imagine, having to take a cable, down, under this trench. What's interesting is, you might think, well, why do they have to sort of go, how do they cross this trench? Is it like a suspension bridge and they kind of, pivot on both points? And they actually can't do that because, then the currents would grab the cable and dislodge it and all that sort of stuff. So they actually do lay the cable on the bottom of the trench and then back up the other side. And to do that, this is an interesting kind of fact, the ship is travelling along and it's kind of feeding out the cable sort of behind it. And they've got all this mathematics and calculations, which actually Kelvin helps sort of pioneer about how fast they have to kind of lay out the cable to make sure it's going to fall at the right kind of speed. And it was 26 kilometres beyond the trench, in 7,000 metres of water when the cable reached 9,000 metres kind of behind it. And so the cable from Sydney to Guam goes 9,000 metres under the ocean. And it took 6 hours to to fall that distance. All right. The other thing, which if you go back to, see, this is a 2014 map. If you go to the every year they've got a different map. You go to the 2013 map, they kind of did it in this old world kind of thing. But what's interesting is they introduced this lit capacity sort of infograph. And what this shows is the width of the lines indicates the amount of capacity, and the number of lines indicates the number of different cables between the kind of two different points. But what you'll see here is basically between Europe or UK and the east coast of the US, this is the the biggest or the fattest kind of internet pipes, or that's where the most capacity is, the transatlantic sort of capacity. And then you can kind of see Africa is actually pretty interesting. If we scroll down here, we can look at this graph, which shows us basically the amount of capacity per sort of
region, and how long when it sort of came online. And so if you look at transatlantic, ever since 2000, the transatlantic, which is this pink one, it's where the bulk of the capacity was. But since sort of 2007 or 2008, there's been this massive kind of build out, and this is where the sort of private investors got involved, big time, because they all wanted to kind of own the market and have the biggest cable. But when you've got 10 people building the biggest cable, nobody's cable is the kind of the biggest. But what you can see is that Trans-Pacific is basically matching, or not matching, but it's pretty close to transatlantic. The other one that's interesting here is latency, network latency constellation is what they call it. So let's say you're in Singapore, and what it shows you, can I scroll in here, to go from Singapore to the United States, that's about 150, 200 milliseconds. And Australia, there you go, Australia to South Africa, that's a pretty, because there's no direct line that goes from Australia to South Africa, it has to go up through Asia and then back around, the coast to South Africa. That itself is around, 150, sort of milliseconds. Anybody know how to make this faster? How to get, lower latency? Hey? Shrink the map. If you can make the speed of light faster, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it. But basically, the fastest you can get, the lowest, well, the latency you get is basically the speed of light between your location and the other location as it sort of follows the cables and things. Yeah, I mean everything along, every bend in the cable adds, well, it's a little bit lower than the speed of light. But if you do the calculation of a speed of light, that gets you, sort of pretty close. That gets you your theoretical sort of maximum, but
Oh yeah. It's coming. It's coming by the end of the year. Sorry, question?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't see any lines between Antarctica and the rest of the world,
Yep.
but I know those guys, there is a lot of research going on in that continent, and those guys have emails and stuff. So how do they communicate?
Yep. So the question was, how does Antarctica, connect to the world? And that's I don't see any cables. So what's interesting, Antarctica.
I also asked the same question about the International Space Station, because I don't see any cables there either, and why not?
Antarctic. There we go. So what's interesting here, this is,
Put the cable up and then brought the whole sky down. Not going to do that again.
there you go, stage 1, stage 2. So the way that the scientists down in Antarctica get internet is it's all via satellite. But just in the last couple of years, the ANU have been developing basically a broadband satellite. And so it's a little 20 kilo box that is in orbit or stationary, fixed orbit, above Antarctica that's able to kind of bounce back. But yeah, that's the real problem with it, because it's on the South Pole. There is no, it can't be sort of stuck in orbit there, and I'm not quite sure how they solved it. Do you happen to know, or?
Well, I would assume they'd have a geostationary above the equator and just point it that way, because that'd be the only way of doing it.
Not necessarily, you can run it that way.
A polar orbit would then require that you'd have at least 3 for
Agreed,
it to
but
be.
they're only little boxes.
Yeah.
But
Have
they're
you ever
also-
tried
they're
carrying
also-
20 kilogram box up to geostationary orbit?
Isn't that also more exposed to solar explosions?
Yeah, like any satellite. Well, yeah, because it's,
The whole magnetosphere is going to come
Yeah.
down on top of it and create a lot of interference.
Just curious how they solve it.
Yeah, there you go. So they're going to do a series of satellites, so they're able to kind of, sort of, in a highly elliptical orbit, similar to what's known as millennial orbit. There you go.
Never heard of that.
So I should have been on that project.
With 2 satellites. There you go. So 2 satellites in continuous orbit would give, continuous satellite coverage. There you go. Yeah. The other thing that you'll notice here is there's actually a cable coming out of Perth, the SEA MEWE3, which is really just an abbreviation for Southeast Asia, Middle East, Western Europe, and the third one. And it's this is one of these consortium cables, and it actually sort of daisy chains up to Singapore and then around India and then up through the Gulf and connects up to Western Europe. But if we go to the 2040, it's been around for a long time, and
We lost our connection to the US. We had to go.
yep, that's exactly right. So what? Well, no. If you lose your connection to the US, you've got to go that way. What actually happened to Microsoft customers was, there's actually a big data center here in Singapore. So that's if you've got Office 365, that's where your email and sort of stuff is hosted out of. Or if you're deploying into the Azure Southeast Asia data center, I think it is, that's Singapore. And so the optimal routing to get there is actually, from Sydney, across to Adelaide, across to Perth, up this link, via Indonesia to Singapore. But what actually happened was around about this kind of kink here, there was a cable cut about 12 months ago. And because it's Indonesia, it took them, 2 months to kind of get it fixed. And during that time, Microsoft customers weren't real happy because their traffic was having, their email, their latency was actually having to go up here via the Australia-Japan cable across into Asia and then back down to Singapore, which adds, about sort of 50, 60 milliseconds worth of latency, which, you can notice that. But the good news is, once we get to 2014, you'll see there's 2 lines here. So there's a new cable proposed, well, it's proposed, it's getting built at the moment, and I think Telstra and Pipe Networks have bought like a pair of fibres each on that, and so that should sort of decrease our latency and increase our bandwidth and whatever to Asia.
Now that cable as well, there's proven documentation from 2002 that John Howard and Telstra were forced into an agreement with the Signals Directorate and the NSA right at that time to put snippers and switches and things into that.
Yep.
Based from like 2002, so that stuff's on WikiLeaks and
Yep.
all sorts of things.
I mean the whole
They've not mentioned any of these access points anywhere, and potential cable snips broken in the sea where people are wondering if it's foreign nations and
exactly they're the
submarines and military personnel
There's the ones we know about, and there's the ones we don't know about.
So all of those faults that were in the unknown 6% could well have been other foreign nations with, submarines and whatever.
Yep, you can't actually see it on this map, but here at the tip of the UK is Land's End, and that's where a significant number of cables kind of land. What's interesting here is through one of these documents, I don't know whether it was one of those documents, but it certainly reported in the news, was that the British equivalent of DSD, GCHQ, Snowden leaks, yeah, so it was in the Snowden leaks. The cable had come in, it had landed, then it went out to sea, I think out to the 9-mile marker, and then back in again. And that was so because the intercept laws or the intercept regulations there said that, okay, if it goes over the 9-mile mark, then it's in international waters and it's not covered by, it's not domestic, surveillance. And so all their tapping and stuff was done, outside of the 9-mile mark, and then it came back into the country.
So they're doing it out into the ocean? Because the US were much more blatant.
Oh yeah, I mean, the US would go into, and I'll show you in a moment.
Straight into the cabinet and had an extra floor in the same building and just...
Yep, absolutely. The other thing was, during the Cold War, there's actually, documented, things of they go along, they'd actually physically tap, a submarine cable, pass it through their own. They basically, take a copy of, they basically put their own sort of repeater on it, take a copy of the data, keep sending the data along, but then they could, just take a copy of everything that's sort of travelling across. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, they took a copy of it. Yep. Yeah, Prism. There you go. Alrighty.
That map up, even prior to all of the telecom systems and stuff with Reuters, the news agency, so like in the 1850s and 1860s, just by the laying all the kind of telecom cables, what was happening was that there was a cable between, say, Dublin and London, and they would actually, there's no cable across the transatlantic, so they'd actually get all of the telegraph notes, and they'd ship them across the Atlantic, rather than waiting around them in Liverpool.
Yeah.
They would get a boat and gaff them off in the Southern Ireland there, and someone would then go through and just run them up through the landline cables
Yeah.
to London. That saved like an hour and a half
Oh.
for news traffic, and Reuters made vast amounts of sales into corporate marketplace and all that sort of thing with that kind of service even before telecoms was properly established.
So I've got an interesting story on that. I'll jump ahead a bit. We go to, have you heard of a guy called Dan Spivey? Other stuff. Here we go. Whoops. There's a guy called Dan Spivey, and he's a pretty clever guy. And he was a trader, working in there's the Chicago Futures Exchange on the left-hand side there, and then there's the New York Stock Exchange. And he was doing they were doing arbitrage, and arbitrage is where they were kind of trading the future price of a company, and him and a bunch of other traders, they used to compete for the fastest, connection between New York and Chicago. And the reason they did that is because they could make a trade on the future price of the company. If they could make it, if they were the first person to make that trade, before, as the price was kind of dropping or falling, in the actual stock exchange, then they could make, a huge amount of money. But what would happen is, because the internet links between, those two cities generally followed the railway kind of rights of way. They kind of follow the railway, and there's a whole set of mountains here, so they kind of generally went around the mountains and things like that. He kind of got really clever, and he's like, what if I built a cable in basically as the crow flies, a direct line between the two exchanges? And so he got the maps out, and he was able to shave off 3 milliseconds and 100, it must be 100 miles or something off the distance between the 2 points, for the internet speed. And because he was able to build that cable, he then had the fastest connection, and they were able to make huge amounts of money trading, the value of the company, before anybody else. But the way he did it actually was quite clever. He went off and he got a builder and basically walked, or they drove the path to make sure, to find the kind of the right way to go about it.
And then he ended up setting up like 40 individual contracts with different drilling companies and sort of laying companies to build the kind of whole thing in segments. Because the thing that he didn't want is he didn't want somebody else coming along and doing the same thing. So he went out and negotiated the individual land rights with all the little councils along the way, and laid this cable, and then just before they were about to light it up, he went and spoke to all the big investment banks and said, hey, we've got something you might be interested in, and basically put it out to the highest bidder, and they sold it to, they had to do an exclusive deal because there's no point having this super fast cable with more than one person on it, and they ended up selling it for huge amounts of money. But he was so obsessive about latency and distance to the point of if the right of way came down one side of the road and then it went over across to the other side of the road, instead of going at a right angle and a right angle, he would actually ask them to go diagonal across the road, because that would shave off a couple of meters or whatever in the overall kind of distance, and very successful.
That hasn't gone away either, right? We've still got the situation today. So, for example, all of the exchanges will sell floor space in the exchange to high-frequency trading operations, all the investment banks.
Yep.
And so what they do there, they guarantee that all of the cages in the banks, this is like even today, that all of those participants will be guaranteed to have the same length
Yep.
network cable
Yep.
between all the switches, so that no one or the other gets a
Yeah.
disadvantage, even now today, and all the really fast exchange operations with
Yep.
gigabit switches and everything there now. It's the same thing going on.
Yeah, regardless of whether your rack is sitting next to the stock exchange trading computer or it's in, next door, well, not next door, but the next room or something, they've all got, the same patch cables so that everybody gets the same, physical sort of distance. Alrighty. People finding this interesting so far? Cool, I get a few nods. Alright. So basically, the message out of this is Australia is kind of connected to the world through, one place, Sydney. So you're in a nice part of the world, unless you want to connect to Asia and then you should go to Perth.
Give this talk in Melbourne.
No, I gave it in Canberra. I mean, Melbourne's got connectivity, but only the Tasmania. This. What's the? The NBN was the first thing to come in. They first laid the NBN in Tasmania. I'm like, well, what's the point? They've got this tiny little pipe going from Tasmania to Melbourne, and.
Buying pulpwood futures are...
Yeah, that's right. All right.
If I was to build a large data centre there, the logical place to build it would be in Sydney, because I've got the best connectivity.
I'm going to get right into that, and that's a great question. And so, we've got these submarine cables that kind of, connect countries or continents. What happens next? And, where do they land? And, and then where do they go? Adam's house. Yeah. And it's pretty easy to kind of dig this sort of stuff up, and what you'll find is that all these cables coming into Sydney, there's 5 or 6 of them in total. They'll land at these places here, Alexandria, Paddington, on Tamarama. What was it? Tamarama. Is that like Canberra versus Canberra? No, Tamarama. Clovelly Beach. And then Narrabeen Beach and Collaroy Beach, and the Pacific Pipe cable actually landed at sort of Collaroy Beach. So you can actually, if you want to know kind of more about these, there's all sorts of websites that kind of track. Duplicate. There's all sorts of websites that track, these different things, but there's actually federal legislation under ACMA, Australian Communications and Media Authority, that lays out protection zones, for these cables, or for these kind of, these beaches where the cables land. And that's basically to say, look, if you're a fisherman or somebody who, either negligently or, purposefully, goes and sort of damages one of these cables, in the ocean, then, there's penalties and all that sort of stuff. And then you can click through to each of these, and it'll show you, a bit more detail about, the different landing stations and all that sort of stuff. So there you go. So Sydney Cable Landing Station's got the Australia-Japan cable, the Pacific Pipe, the Southern Cross, Telstra Endeavour, and then the new one, the Pacific Fibre cable. The other thing I wanted to show you was telegeography. So, I mean, these guys are awesome. What they actually, they built their business of sort of consolidating, where all these cables were, and
they started looking at, okay, who's building them, who's using them, and things like that. And so if you come along and go to their sort of research services, they can tell you, and this kind of leads to your question, if I want to build a data center and I want it to be, well connected, or I need, I want it to be kind of the lowest cost or something like that, these guys actually sell research, sort of subscriptions, which will tell you, how much it costs to plug into, different networks in different locations kind of around the world. And they'll also tell you what's the, is the cost coming up or down, how much capacity is around, and all that sort of stuff. But they also tell you, the cables and how much of the cables are utilised and all that sort of stuff. Alrighty. Does that look interesting to anybody? There's a nice big RV camper van there. So straight away, it's America or Canada. Yeah, arrow right hand side, and the sunshine means it's probably California somewhere. Anybody notice the 4 posts here? So turns out with a little bit of research, and I know you can't see it yet, we can actually jump on to Google Street View, and there's those same 4 posts. And we go back to 2008. There you go, no posts. Then we jump to 2009. The posts are there. The grass is kind of a little bit longer. And you jump to 2011. It's similar to when that other photo was kind of taken. But what's interesting about this is Grover Beach in Southern California. And so this is basically, there's a big cable that goes Australia to Guam. Guam's over, there you go, Guam, which is a US foreign territory. And we go back into Grover Beach. What's actually interesting is, although the cable kind of comes in on this beach, West Grand Avenue, it sort of lands on this beach, and the manhole cover is, sort of somewhere there. The actual landing station, where all the equipment and the sort of termination sort of equipment is, it's actually a fair way away. We actually scroll down here, and I think I did find it somewhere, and it's kind of here, but really you got to look for a large sort of nondescript building with some big air conditioners and sort of stuff outside. Kind of looks like a data center. The other thing that's interesting is we go to Equinix Sydney. So the question you're all asking is, okay, where in Sydney are these? Well, it's actually not a landing station, but this is, well, I should probably jump back here. View, slideshow, present view, there we go. So what happened, so the cable has landed, it's kind of, it's been terminated at one of these landing stations, and really those landing stations got 2 purposes. It's where the optical, or the trans, the submarine cable sort of optical stuff sort of terminates. It's also where the power units are to kind of power the repeaters, so big, 11,000 volts repeaters. But then, once it's kind of terminated there, that's when it starts connecting to, the people who are paid for capacity on that cable. And so we can actually go to a website called peeringdb.com. And until these guys started up, it was kind of up to each cable provider or each network provider to kind of put up their own website and say, hey, we've got this cable and we would love for you to connect your network into our network. But the quality of that information was kind of really hard to find, and so these guys kind of made it easy, and they allow network providers to kind of own their own page. And so we come along here and say exchange points, and then we go country AU. And what you can see here is these are all the different internet exchange points. Now, an internet exchange is basically where ISPs come together and network providers come together. They all have kind of these shared switches, and they all agree to kind of plug their switches into each other's so that they can route and kind of share traffic. And so, a quick glance at this list, there is 2 pages, but there's nothing, well, there is Pipe Networks, which is kind of the second biggest one, but the biggest provider here is actually the Equinix Sydney Exchange. It's got 163 different providers or participants that participate kind of in that exchange. And so if we go and click through to there, and go to Equinix Sydney,
the local, the facility is in Mascot, and we can grab an address there. We can go to 639 Gardeners Road. There we go, and we hit Street View. Sure looks like a data center to me. And you go down the street a bit. If you're lucky, you can scroll in and see the manhole covers. There's usually big fiber optics underneath and all that sort of stuff. And then if you scroll this way, it might be the other way. There's like a security gate and all that sort of stuff. But essentially, what this peering website is saying is that within this facility, there's 163 different providers that kind of get together. And so your question about, hey, I'm building a data center or I'm building a service, Sydney is probably a good place, but where in Sydney? Here would be a pretty good place to kind of plug in. And what you can see is that Amazon.com, they've got their network connected in this place. Akamai, anybody know what Akamai is? Yep, content delivery network. So if you go to, let's do a test. Download.microsoft.com. It's going to resolve to, there you go. So download.microsoft.com is actually served by Akamai, and Akamai have these servers all around the world close to the users that actually have the files cached so that users don't have to download it from across the world. And so it's actually going to A767 Akamai.net. And so what will be interesting here is I did this in Canberra, and I was on the Microsoft network, and the routing was actually pretty interesting. But what we can do is take a trace route to that, and I'm hoping that it ends up at about less than 10 milliseconds. But it may end up being slightly different. So the other thing that happens here, so there we go. So we're at Exetel. So that's the kind of local ISP. Then we go off to from the local ISP, we'll then connect up to somebody else and all that sort of stuff. But there we go, Sydney, AAPT. When I did this in Canberra, what happened was it ended up going from Canberra to San Jose in California. And it's like, well, hang on, isn't Akamai supposed to be a local, content delivery thing? And it turns out if anybody's using a DNS server that is not a local DNS server, say, for example, using Google's DNS server, or you're using Unblock Us, something like that to kind of fake out that you're located in a place where you actually aren't, that actually affects these content delivery networks, and so that can actually slow down your downloads from stuff that is served over Akamai. But what we can see here is that SGL, so I'm guessing SG is probably Sydney because it's 3 milliseconds and 15. So I can't explain that kind of jump. That means that it's probably not actually Sydney, it's probably like Brisbane or something like that, but it's certainly better than the US. It's not going over those kind of transcontinental ones. If you also look through here, you'll find Microsoft or IINet, so IINet, big ISP, Cloudflare, which is another sort of caching provider, EA, Electronic Arts, so have you got Xbox or Google were there, did you see Google? So you can also click through to these guys and see who else they peer with around the world. And so this is kind of interesting for looking at, okay, to get the lowest latency or the least number of hops or the best kind of connections, you can look at your ISP and see how are they connected into this kind of this fabric, Facebook. And so what you'll find is like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all the big kind of providers, they're plugged into as many of these internet exchanges as they can because they want their networks to be as close as possible to their users. All right. Anything else anybody wants to look at in here? The other one was pipe networks. Actually, if we go to Sydney, well, as an example, I brought up Canberra, and basically, if you're in Canberra and you're getting internet, the only facility you've got is Transact House, which is on Northbourne Avenue. But and they're the different providers that are also so hosted there. If we go to Pipe Networks Sydney, so they're the next biggest sort of provider in Sydney, and they're located out of, so they're actually got connection points in multiple sort of places around Sydney, so Glebe, Haymarket, and their own facility. All right. So the other thing is, okay, I just showed Sydney there. What we can also do is bring up net exchange points. We can bring up the worldwide internet exchange points. Can anybody guess where the center of the internet is, or the biggest exchange point might be? Somewhere in America. Anybody hedge a bet with Europe?
It's hard to get with one side of the Atlantic, right?
Yeah, you're pretty close. It's actually Frankfurt in Germany, or and Amsterdam, are sort of, depending on how you measure it, whether it's in number, throughput maximum or average or members or whatever, they kind of compete. And then the next kind of biggest ones are, you get into Ashburn, Virginia, which is on the east coast of the US, and that's basically that's where the NSA go if they want to tap into things coming out of America. They go to Ashburn. And they did exactly that. So if we go and look at, we can actually go and look at those exchanges, and they have live sort of traffic statistics. And so this is the Amsterdam exchange, and what you can see is during their daytime, it peaks about 9, 10 p.m. at night, and sort of drops off sort of suddenly. But we're talking about 3 terabits per second each way. Sorry.
We're just debating why that is, and it could be people backing up data, or it could be people looking at porn.
Netflix, streaming videos is actually a pretty, huge, or streaming video just in general, whether people are sitting at home watching YouTube or whatever. That's, a big one. Then if we go to Frankfurt, this is what their traffic looks like. Much, very similar shape. Kind of ramps up, and their incoming averaged 7.1. Gigabits per second, so that doesn't actually match up with. I thought it was a lot more, but maybe I'm just reading the graph wrong or something like that. So here's kind of a summary of where we're sort of at. You've got you over here. You connect to your ISP. Your ISP connects to they plug into an internet exchange point, and at that point you can access other ISPs, or you can access local content providers. And some local content providers are actually, instead of joining at these internet exchanges, they're joining up with the ISPs directly. And I've got an example of why they would do that when we talk about Netflix. And then if you want to jump across to the US, for example, you come across to one of the big exchange points in San Jose, and then you can access the content providers over there. All right. Has anybody seen this one before? So Netflix had I guess it was Netflix's problem. So Netflix is a video streaming service. You pay a monthly fee. I believe they're coming to Australia. If you know how to, you can get it in Australia. But their problem was that people had these, these Fios connections, Verizon Fios, which is basically fiber to the house, and they're paying like $50 a month for unlimited download and 50 megabits, each way. But then, their Netflix speed, they'd still get choppy video or low quality video. And it turns out that it wasn't, their connection which was the problem. It was the Verizon's connection, with Netflix that was the problem. And then there's other companies like Comcast and Time Warner Cable, and so they're the really kind of the big sort of players in the American consumer sort of broadband market. But what was happening was, because Netflix was sending huge amounts of data to subscribers, that consumed a lot of the bandwidth on that ISP's kind of network ports and switches. And so but the way that these internet connections work is it's kind of like a handshake agreement. And if we go back to the peering DB, we can see here that that one doesn't have a policy. If we go to exchange points, and we go to, let's go to AMS-IX. Actually, we've got to go to like an individual provider. Oh, there we go, it was on the right hand side there. So you can see here the policy here is either restrictive, open, or selective. So an open peering policy means, if you want to plug into our network, that's cool. Just pay us the per month port fee to kind of plug in, and if traffic is destined to your network, we'll happily kind of pass it to you, and vice versa. If you've got traffic destined for our network, we'll accept it and kind of route it for you. Selective is where
they're obviously selective about it, and then restrictive is that, well, hang on, we're only going to allow, if you pay us this, this monthly fee, for a certain amount of bandwidth, we'll kind of take that traffic, but you're going to pay us for it. And so what was happening with Netflix and the ISPs in the States was Comcast was saying, well, look, we think that you guys, Netflix, you should be paying us a whole bunch of money to access our subscribers. And Netflix has said, no, that's not how the internet works. And so they basically held their Netflix users at ransom, but at the same time they put this up to say, look, it's not us, that's the problem, it's your ISP that's trying to charge an extra fee to access the subscribers. And so if you read the news stories and stuff online, they call it the net neutrality. But what's interesting is they call it net neutrality, but it's kind of, there's always two sides to the argument. What they want to do is they want to charge they want to have kind of this express lane, so instead of just paying your normal internet access fee, they want you to pay a little bit more to access, other services. And so, the Facebooks of the world and the Google of the world say that, no, the internet is one price, and that's the beauty of the internet. Whereas, Comcast and Time Warner say, no, we want to make money out of this. And so there's a huge debate in America about that. And anyway, what ended up happening was, Netflix and Comcast did some backroom deal, and now suddenly, the average speed of streaming, got a whole lot better. But what actually happened was they probably paid them for it or made some sort of agreement where they gave them more ports and more bandwidth and all that sort of stuff.
There's one big thing about that though. You've got to recognise that they believe that Netflix traffic represents about 35% of all internet traffic in the United States at the moment.
Yep.
That's why it's quite a big deal. All of the internet traffic for everything in the United States, they believe about 35% of it is that one company, just video streaming from Netflix.
Yeah, and then
because
they make they've got to provide this connection, and traditionally they've made money because they'll sell a 100 megabit connection, but people only use 1 megabit of it. Now people have got this 100 megabit connection, and they're actually using more of it and downloading and streaming and all that sort of stuff. So
Well, a lot of them are really unlimited. They don't calculate. Whereas at least in Australia, they go, well, you
Yeah.
used to 300 megabits, you have to pay us more.
and you get kind of cut off, or you got to pay more. And so I don't think we will sort of have these problems because our capacity is limited by just the economics of it already. Whereas in the US, you don't, when you sign up to an internet plan, you don't sign up for a cap. You sign up for how big do you want the pipe. And like nobody actually, nobody talks about the size of nobody talks about the download rates.
Surely it's how big it is it? It's just a monthly plan, that's it.
Yeah. So if we go to Issaquah Highlands broadband. So Issaquah is like a suburb of Seattle, which is where Microsoft is based, and this is like a community, and then part of building a house in the community was you had to wire it into the fiber network of that community. We come along here, we say choose a plan today. Do you want 1 gigabit for $200 a month, or do you want 10 megabits for $50 a month? And they don't talk about how much you can download with those plans. It's just how fat do you want the pipe. Different world.
That's the same as Europe as well.
Yep, same in Europe. It's not in Australia, which is unfortunate, but yeah. Well, TPG get in a lot of trouble for having unlimited plans, but they're not truly unlimited.
This is unlimited because the minute you get capped out, they give you like a K per hour.
Yeah,
So, it's unlimited.
yeah,
Good luck to you.
unlimited star. Yeah. So now if you see like the ads for TPG and Optus and whatever on the bus bus seats and whatever, they're all unlimited, but it's not just a little star anymore. It's actually in like half the size of the main font. It's unlimited this, that, and that, and whatever, and the rest is kind of limited because they can't truly say that it's unlimited. All right, so now we're going to talk about Azure ExpressRoute. Does anybody know what this is? Think so? Okay. Basically, I don't know whether it's going to be available in Australia or not, but it's kind of relevant to this conversation because this is sort of the traditional way people would connect, to a, say you're hosting your servers, your business's servers up in Azure or Amazon or something like that. The way that you would traditionally connect to it is either directly over the public internet, or you'd set up a VPN and you'd kind of tunnel, through the public internet, to your servers. That's kind of not real good for a few reasons. One is, you're limited by the bandwidth of that VPN. You're going over the public internet, so your performance, is susceptible to, the conditions of the public internet, and there's a couple of other reasons. But with ExpressRoute, you get there's kind of two different flavors of ExpressRoute. One flavor is this ExpressRoute partner location, and so think about those internet exchanges around the world. Because Microsoft is plugged in there and all these other kind of networks are sort of plugged in there, what ExpressRoute sort of says is if you want to plug your network into the Azure network, you can pay us and you can pay Microsoft, and we'll let you basically patch in your network to the Windows Azure network, and that allows you to basically connect in without going over the public internet. Now, you shouldn't think of it as a security thing, because it's still just a patch cable. There's nothing stopping the NSA or whatever, clamping their thing onto it. Not that they would, or not that Microsoft kind of would knowingly let them, but essentially it's a way to get a direct connection into Azure. The other option here is the service through a service provider. So imagine you're running a big business and you've got sites in Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, or you're in the US and you've got sites all across the US. Usually you'll be going through a network provider. In the US it'd be something like AT&T or Verizon, and you'd say, I want to connect my my different buildings across a WAN so that they're all on kind of the same network. With ExpressRoute and the service provider option, you can say to them, I also want you to connect into another site and call that site Azure. And so that allows people on that network to access services in Azure via that kind of private sort of fiber network. Just as an indication, and there's kind of the breakdown of the two options. The exchange provider option, you get high flexibility because you're physically patching in a cable, but the downside of that is you've got to have the people that know how to do that, or you've got to pay somebody who has that sort of knowledge and sort of capability. But the upside is you can get up to 10 gigabits. On the other side, if you're going through a service provider and you want to hook up to Windows Azure, you can just sort of call them up and say, hey, hook me into Windows Azure. But the downside is the throughput is based. The throughput is 1 gigabits per second. So this is pricing as of April this year, and it's US pricing. But as you can see, if you want to do 10 gigabits and you want to get 250 terabytes included, it's 10,000 a month. Where down here you're paying 10,000 a month for like a tenth of the speed. But anyway, as Azure comes to Australia, I reckon that something like this will sort of probably get turned on at some point. But if you are running services, if you want to move all your infrastructure to Azure, and you've got a significant connection there, this means that you're not limited by your ISP's connection. You can be limited just by how fast you can sort of plug into that sort of network. That's all I had. Anybody got any sort of other questions or topics they want me to talk about? No? The other thing that I'll show you is, if you're interested in this in kind of more detail, there's a committee called the International Cable Protection Committee, and they actually published a report, where is it, publications, with the United Nations Environmental Program called the ICPC UNEP report. And if you come along here, they've got a whole lot of details on how they do the mapping of the ocean. Oops. How they map the ocean and how they determine where to lay the cables. And they talk about a lot of things that I've kind of sort of talked about today, and they go through the history, and there's a piece of fibre cable and things like that. But or the other option is there's the the tubes book, which kind of covers the sort of the business at a sort of a much sort of broader level. If there's no more questions, yep, question.
So when there's some damage, do they actually dive down, or how do they fix those kind of problems?
Yep. So the question is damage. How do they fix the damage? Cable faults.
If we cable maintenance, yeah, for 12,000 metres down to the Mariana Trench. Yeah. Here we go, cable. Submarine cable fault fixing. No, they don't generally send one of these down there. What they will do is they basically send a ship out, because they've got, within each cable they have they know how far, they know basically where the cable is broken or where the fault is.
Send a signal out, look for the reflection and time that will tell you where it's broken.
Yeah.
And then they can map that to the location.
Yeah, because they're getting like a ping back from a repeater kind of either side of it, so they know that it's in that location. And so what they'll go and do, they'll send one ship out to go and pick up, one half of the cable, then they'll send another ship out to get the other half of the cable, they'll bring them together, fuse it up, and then they'll lay it down again. So they do actually pick the cable up off the seabed and essentially lay it down again. Well, yeah, there's all sorts of mathematics and theory about, how much slack is in the cable, because too much slack means that you've got you're not going to have enough cable to get one to the other, and not enough slack means that ocean currents and things like that are going to pull your cable taut and sort of damage it and things like that.
They're laying a sort of sine wave along the bottom of the ocean.
They lay it based upon the survey, so they don't lay a straight line. They'll lay it. They've got these detailed maps where.
And that looks as though it's to follow geography.
Yep.
When it's going in a relatively straight line, where that text is, for example, or there, I would imagine they would still be laying it in a sine wave, so that there'd be enough
Sort of give it a.
pull up either end.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how they kind of leave the sort of slack in it, but it'd be fairly easy to kind of work out.
How much does it stretch?
Not very far at all. Alrighty. Anything? Yep. Question?
Routing.
Yep.
If I want to talk to a server, in the middle of the US somewhere, just talk me through the process of what happens from my PC through to the server over there, and how it knows to find that, and what goes four-letter word when something breaks. How does that handle it?
Yep. Sounds good. So there's kind of a couple of different things at play here. First of all, on your local machine, you'll have a routing table. Route print. And that routing table is going to have a whole bunch of local ones, and then it's going to have this one called 0.0.0.0, which is basically the default route. And this, on my machine, this says that when I've got something that doesn't match any of these, send it to this gateway here. And this gateway here happens to be the router in this kind of office. That server, which is 10.26.40.8, it then goes to its routing table and goes, I've got this IP address I need to get to, which is 6552. How do I get to that? And it goes, well, I don't have it's not a machine on my local network. I need to pass it to my default router. And so they keep kind of passing it off, to their default routers. The other thing that's kind of at play here is BGP, Border Gateway Protocol. And if we go to Looking Glass AT&T, BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, is basically a way that all those, if we go back to peering DB, it's a way that all these different networks, so we'll just pick one, have, there we go, they have these ranges. And these ranges, there we go, have IP address, I don't know how to get to it. Oh yeah, so this is saying that, there you go. So this company, Symantec, in Equinix Sydney has this IP address. And that IP address that IP address will show up in a BGP routing table. And so this is a routing table, it's like the shared state of the internet. And so all the routers are kind of exchanging this routing table, with each other kind of, all the time. And so that's how they're able to work out which networks they need to kind of contact to get to the next, or, to get to, their sort of destination. But an interesting thing here is that although I'm doing a trace route from me to a server, so we'll go, google.com, because Microsoft doesn't respond to pings. This is only showing me, there's actually two routes at play. There's the route that you take to get to your destination, and then there's a route that the traffic takes on the way back. And in general, it's pretty much the same, and that's symmetric routing. But it is possible to have asymmetric routing, and that's where your traffic might take one connection to get somewhere, and it might take a completely different connection to get back.
That's taking forever to say that things took 1 or 2 milliseconds. This just seems farcical to me that it sort of takes 2 10 seconds.
Well, if we go,
So the trace route protocol works.
yes,
Take a ping back from everyone, when it's gone all the way back.
yeah. So the way,
That's just trace route with the ARP tables and stuff that it uses.
so the ping is going, directly to, this address here, which only takes 3 milliseconds. So that's, probably in Sydney somewhere. But for me to determine or for traceroute to determine the steps it took along the way, what it actually does is it does a ping to this location here with a time to live or a hop count of 1. Yep.
Okay, and what would your next step be?
No, not even that. What it's doing is it's doing a ping to this location here, but it's doing a ping with a time to live, which is basically how many hops are you allowed to take before you die, and increasing hop count for each one of these. So this would be a hop count of 1. So, ping this server up here with a hop count of 1. You're only going to get a response back from this guy. Then, ping this guy up here with a hop count of 2. You're going to get a response back for him. And so that's why it takes so long to get the entire trace route. Because there's you can't kind of just run this calculator that says, oh, this is the route that it's going to take, because it's up to each router along the way to determine what the next kind of hop is.
And it could change its mind between one of the...
Oh, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Change its mind. Based upon network conditions or routing tables changing and things like that.
Okay, my next question is... Oh, sorry, am I...
No, you're right. Keep going.
I want to make my website faster. I have lots of data on it, and just talk to me about, there are obvious things I can do to make my website faster on the server, but getting the traffic out of my website and onto your browser, what can I do to make it faster?
Look at your DNS server.
Yeah, so the question was, I got a website, how do I make it faster? What sort of things can I do? My first option would be to go to YSlow, which is a open source tool, comes out of Yahoo. And you can come along here and you can say, you can download the extension, or you can grab they have a mobile version as well. Yeah, mobile bookmarklet. Are you willing to tell me your website, or should I just use Adam's website?
Use Adam's website.
Okay.
I'm thinking about planning in general, nothing in specific.
Okay. So I go ssw.com.au.
It's been embarrassing for you, right?
So basically, I've added that link to my favorites, and then using a bit of JavaScript, I can then click that link. Oh, wrong one. Drag and drop the YSlow button.
You can install this as a Chrome extension too. That works better.
There we go. So now it works. So if we go to ssw.com.au, and have you seen Scott Hanselman's blog post on Chrome extensions? It's worth showing. Basically, Chrome extensions are malware, or they can be malware very easily. The way he did it was, it's like his third post. No, Plex. No, newsletter of wonderful things. It's going to be easy to search.
Search on Chrome.
You can see how far I am behind in my blog posts. Can you trust your browser extensions? And so there he is. He's got this cool extension that lets him download YouTube videos just by, it basically finds a YouTube video in any page he's browsing and adds a little download button. But then he's browsing this other page, his own website, and this video ad pops up. He's like, huh?
I don't have any video ads on my site. How did that get there? And turns out it was a Chrome extension that was injecting, some adware onto any site that he viewed, including his own site. So be careful which Chrome extensions you install.
That's why you do it on you put that computer, like you go and do these, experiment with these things on
Yeah.
Z,
Yep.
and then that's
You block it down.
Yeah,
Yep. But so why slow? I thought so. Go add to favorites. Why slow? Yes. It's w.com.au. Come along here. I probably got a favorites. There we go. That was the problem. So once you're on a website, you click that that link out of your favorites, and it brings up this kind of iframe. Then you hit run test, and what it's using is JavaScript, basically downloading the components of that page and looking at whether the components are compressed. So what we're seeing here is that this page has 36 external JavaScript scripts, 11 external style sheets, and 10 external background images. So basically it's saying, look, the less round trips you can do to the server, the better. So if you combine all those into one resource file, that could be better. It's saying, use a content delivery network. So instead of putting, 1.5 meg worth of stuff on your website, put it on, Akamai or somebody else's website so that that's closer to the users and all that sort of stuff. The other one here is reduce DNS lookups. So because he's got all these different components living on these different sites, every one of those has to do a DNS lookup. And so that's extra latency, that the users have to do before they can, view your site. Yeah, Google Analytics, Google Access, Google Ag Manager, Amazon, AWS, CloudFront. So, I mean, there's people like CloudFront which will do a lot of that for you. You just kind of expose your website via CloudFront, and everything, gets compressed and all that sort of stuff via them. But yeah, did we answer your question? Yep.
I was just going to say DNS propagation basically works the same way, right? When you get a new web address, it just basically writes that IP address that maps it servers around the world.
Yep. So the question was DNS propagation, how does that work? So we come along here and go to ssw.com.au and we choose, I'm on Dig Web Interface, which is basically a web interface to a Unix command tool. If I choose, the way kind of DNS propagation works is I'll choose Nick, and that's saying go and find this domain name, and associated with that domain name there's going to be a name server record. And that name server record is the authoritative name server. So now I can go and say, I want to browse the authoritative name server, for this site. And it's telling me that from the authoritative name server, ssw.com.au has an A record, which is a pointer to an IP address of 174.36.198.26. That now tells my computer what address or what server that I need to contact and then route to access this website. The other thing that can happen here is if we have www.ssw, depends how they've got this set up. It goes directly to an IP address. The other one might be you can do a CNAME record. So for example, this is my Visual Studio Online account, and I'll just go default resolver, dig. So you can see here that name actually resolves to a CNAME, which is actually another name. And so that I then have to go on, my computer then has to go and look up that name to find out the IP address. Now, you can actually, if you look at, Troy Hunt actually did a blog post on I think some sort of malware that he was investigating or something like that, and they were doing click fraud, so basically manufacturing through JavaScript people clicking on ads so that the person who was displaying the ads was getting extra money. But it turns out the DNS records, there was like 10 redirects there. So for someone to click on this ad, they had to do 10 DNS lookups, to get through to the final site. So they weren't very efficient about, doing their click fraud, sort of stuff. But the reason they did it is to kind of hide the real source of the fraud and stuff.
It's quite complicated as well with the DNSs, for example. So say you're an OptusNet customer and you put their DNSs, well, they actually cache all those entries as well.
Yep.
So if you go to Microsoft.com, they've actually had to go from their DNS servers to find out Microsoft's authoritative record or whatever too. So they cache it locally, so then some other person or OptusNet goes to Microsoft.com and they'll get it faster because it's already in the DNS cache from their ISP. So depending on
So an example of that is if you come along, put a name in, and then go trace, and then hit dig, it'll actually show you how that DNS gets resolved through the hierarchy of DNS servers. And so what's happening here is we're going off to one of the root servers. There's like A to J or something like that. And then those root servers will then tell me that, okay, I need to go to the Azure DNS server, and then the Azure DNS server, because it's the authoritative one, it can then give me the address, which can then give me the IP address. But if we go and look at, it doesn't actually show it here. If I do, ns lookup -d1 or -d2, and scroll through the outputs here, you can actually see the records here, which is saying, look, Microsoft.com has a TTL of refresh of 2 hours and a retry of kind of 10 minutes. So that's saying that any DNS server kind of along the way, it can cache the fact that the fact that this is the Microsoft.com kind of response for up to 2 hours. But like you were saying, is that a lot of DNS servers say, oh, that TTL, I don't care. I'm just going to ignore that, and I'm going to cache it for 2 weeks, because why would anybody want to change an IP address more than every 2 weeks? And that's where you see things like if you've got a website and you need to change hosting providers, that's where TTL and DNS propagation can really hurt you. We actually saw this in Visual Studio Online, where we were using Azure Traffic Manager, which basically is like a DNS sort of redirect sort of thing. But even 3 weeks after we changed our DNS from pointing to Traffic Manager, pointing back to the IP address that you saw here, we were still getting people coming in via that old IP address, and that's because their ISP or their machine or whatever hadn't wasn't respecting that time to live, and eventually, we just had to, cut them off and force them to retry. So that's why when you're setting up DNS names, you try and keep your IP address the same if you ever possibly can. And if you're on Azure, a way to do that is Azure reserved IPs. So you can actually Azure will actually allow you to reserve an IP address. Last 12 months, and so your first 5 is free if they're in use, and then the additional ones are like $3 a month, because IP addresses aren't actually, they're a limited sort of resource at the moment until we move to IPv6, if we ever do.
The reason why there's such a short TTL on Microsoft.com is probably because it really changed in 20 years.
Well, it has. I mean, Microsoft.com, the Microsoft.com website is actually, it's not one web server or one farm of web servers. There's lots of different farms that serve up different parts of Microsoft.com, and they're all served up using application request routing, net/ARR, which is basically like a software sort of load balancer that says, oh, if you're going to Microsoft.com/this, that's actually served off a SharePoint farm, or if you're going to Microsoft.com/this, that's served off this other farm. And so they use this application request routing kind of on the front end to kind of serve up that sort of stuff. And the reality is the majority of it's actually behind Akamai anyway. Like, I know MSDN. Yeah.
There's a nifty little tool that goes out and finds a whole lot of common DNS servers that are supported by various ISPs around the tracks,
Mm-hmm.
and then starts to run comparisons on how fast they are with latency back to you.
Yep.
I found that interesting because going through the Office one traditionally had always been quite crap,
Mm-hmm.
and if I manually changed it to somebody else, the whole internet became so much more reliable.
Yeah, the question was, well, the comment was around whose DNS server do I use, and I can test them all and check the latency. I'd be careful about that because, like I said,
Security aspects.
well, there's 2 parts. There's security aspects. Anybody guess why Google have a public DNS server? Are they just nice people and want to make the internet better? They are looking at what you are. What host names you're resolving, and they're feeding that into their search algorithm to give you better results and things like that. So it's not coincidence that they offer a public DNS service. It's actually they get benefit from it as well. But like I said, with the CDNs and the location, the way the location sort of sniffing works is they don't, like when I go to download.microsoft. In fact, this will be interesting. Download Microsoft.com, and I'll say use all the resolvers, so it picks about 8 of them,
and they're all going to get different results. You know, this is 184.50, 184.51, because that's, you know, that's the US. But then as soon as we're going from Hong Kong, we're getting 183, and then as soon as we're using there we go, UNet in China, you know, we're getting 72 address. The way that Akamai and these global traffic manager kind of solutions work is they call it a ping matrix of, they're looking at the DNS servers that are requesting DNS names from them, and they're constantly pinging them, and they're keeping this matrix up of, okay, which one, what's the latency between, you know, this DNS server and me? Okay, well that's, you know, that's actually closer to this node that we've got. So next time somebody asks for this, you know, download.microsoft.com, we'll send them, you know, over to this server over here. But the problem with that is, you know, one, if you're using a DNS server which is away from you, you know, that's going to give you a bad result. And two is, if that ping matrix is not kept up to date or is not functioning for whatever reason, you know, they have no idea where to send you, so they'll just send you, you know, to kind of the default.
There's about 20 that are based around Sydney.
Yep.
And if you just swap to maybe IINet instead of Telstra
Or Optus or something like that. Yep.
quite often you can get a much better result.
Yep. The other thing that they'll do is I think Telstra does this, at least Telstra Mobile does this. If you go and try and access a name that doesn't actually exist, they will redirect you to, you know, their website and say, oh, were you looking for this? And, you know, some companies in the US do this because they are able to put ads across it. And so they go, oh, you know, you're now using our search engine, we'll show you some ads because, you know, you can't type in the, you know, the right thing, or, you know, that link is kind of no longer there. So.
They can also do some good things. So, like, for example, your ISP is probably offering you like unmetered
Yep.
ABC because it realizes when you run through their DNS service that they can send that through their local mirror, and they haven't had to do anything other than just use that local network between you and them. So you've got some privileges and advantages by using the DNS of your host as well. And it can go the other way too, in that they can cross traffic and do horrible things to competitors as well. So,
Yep.
be careful about how you do that.
Alrighty. Yeah, you know, there's definitely variations in DNS providers. I haven't found a good one yet. All right, well, thank you everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it. I believe there's going to be some eval forms, and I believe that you've got to fill out the eval forms if you want pizza or something like that. And if you're listening online, thanks for joining us. Martin, if you're there, g'day. And we'll talk to you later. All right, thanks guys.
Did you get all that? We'll take the SSW TV quiz and test your knowledge now.